He's been protecting our planet for more than 60 years. So does David Suzuki still have hope for the future of our planet?
This is the Earth Day Party Podcast with Shannon Burns and Sarah Christie. Get in, bestie. We're going to clean up the planet.
Hello and welcome to the Earth Day Party. My name is Shannon.
I'm Sarah.
And I'm so excited for this podcast because we are going to dive into conversations with so many different experts throughout Earth Month about the planet, sustainability, what we can do to make a difference as well, especially in times where it feels like we have no power at all.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we're kicking it off with a little bit of a bang here. I mean, when you think about some of the biggest environmental activists globally, there's probably, you can count on one hand the names that come to mind. And today's guest is certainly one of them, David Suzuki.
Yeah, I couldn't believe that we had a conversation with him. I'm also glad that we're Canadian because he asked us that right off the bat, too.
It really was such an honor. And the day that we recorded this conversation is worth noting because it kind of felt like a heavy day, especially if you're in North America. It was the day that the tariffs came into place. And so everything felt uncertain. There was just an extra weight, as if we aren't all feeling heavy right now with trying to keep up with what's going on in the world. But that felt particularly important. And to talk to someone of his expertise on a day like that, where he's been trying to wake up the world to these conversations for, decades, that was really, really special.
I'm so excited for this podcast. I feel like, Sarah, you're the expert in my life when it comes to anything about the planet. But what I'm so excited for with this podcast is I feel like I don't know enough. So I'm excited to be able to ask all of these experts what we can actually do and what power we have, especially in times where it feels kind of hopeless, right?
Absolutely. And there's no better person to be asking those questions to than Dr. David Suzuki. In the interview, he also mentions COP, which is not necessarily something, the COP conference, not necessarily something that everybody follows. So
it doesn't have to do with police, right? It's different.
Yeah, exactly. I wrote down a definition just in case that perks any ears throughout the conversation. So COP, C-O-P, that stands for the Conference of the Parties. It's been happening yearly since 1995. A key task of this conference is to review the national communications and emission inventories submitted by all the parties. So essentially, every country gets involved and gets together and says, hey, what are you doing? How did you do this year on your emissions? And what can we do better next year? And they come together. Like, it's all the world leaders coming together on these really important environmental issues.
Gotcha. Okay.
Do you want to hear some of his accolades?
Oh, I would absolutely.
Dr. David Suzuki. Remarkable career. Okay, environmental activist, voice for the voiceless. You could know him from hosting The Nature of Things, from his foundation. Perhaps you've read one of his 50-plus books that he's published.
Wow.
In 2006, he was named a Companion of the Order of Canada, which is one of the highest levels of the honor. In 2007, Time magazine named him one of the most innovative and influential protectors of the planet.
Wow.
And on March 24th, he celebrated his 89th birthday. If you follow the David Suzuki Foundation on social media, you might have spotted the recent article that they shared where David was quoted saying, "Now is not the time to fade into the final years of retirement. Not when temperatures and sea levels continue to rise, wildfires grow stronger, and droughts become more persistent." It really doesn't get more selfless than that. So what an honor it is that David Suzuki was able to join us for this series.
I'm so excited. And he was so passionate, too, in his conversation. So I really feel like there is a lot to learn. So hopefully you take something away from it as well.
Here's our conversation with Dr. David Suzuki, where he gets into, is it too late to take action? Where should we really be focusing our intention when it comes to climate activism? And a message to his younger self.
I'm Shannon. So nice to meet you.
Is this a Canadian group or an American group?
Canadian.
Okay.
I'm glad that we are for that answer.
It's definitely not lost on me speaking to you today about this topic when such major headlines are taking everyone's attention, but that seems to be the going trend. Major headlines, not necessarily Canadian headlines, are dominating our attention. So what are the serious items at risk because of the climate crisis here in Canada, here in our own backyard, that we need to be paying attention to?
Well, I mean, the fact of the matter is the planet is under assault now by this deadly predator, which is us. And what's going on right now in the United States, it seems to me, is a triumph of capitalism. And what you see, it's the triumph of a person who, by any criterion you want to apply, is insane. The man is totally insane. And we're running around acting as if, oh, it's just a matter if we can give him more information and act with reason. The guy is nuts. And we have to face the fact that the head of the most powerful nation on the planet, the major contributor to the problems that we're facing, is crazy. And so what we've got to be doing is saying, how do we as a nation and the rest of the world get as far away from being under his finger as we are? We're trying to use reason. It ain't going to work because we're all trapped within systems, legal, economic, and political. Those systems that shape and guide and constrain us don't recognize the fundamental fact that our very existence, our very well-being, is dependent on the generosity of Mother Nature. And if we don't start with that, and our systems are all developed around us, we're not going to come to grips with the issue. I have spent my entire life as an adult trying to explain the fundamental fact that nature is the source of everything. And I've learned all of that from Indigenous people. They need to know the things that I tell children. I start with children by saying, what do you think is the most important thing that we all need? And, it goes, mother and dad, and my dad's job, and I need clothing, and I need food. And I say, I want you to take a deep breath. Now you hold that breath for 5 minutes. I'll keep on talking, and you hold your breath. And of course, children are so trusting, they take a deep breath, and within seconds, they're starting to turn pink. And by half a minute, most of them have exhausted. And I say, we need air every minute of our lives. And we need breath, air every minute of our lives. What happens to that air that you breathe in? It goes deep into your lungs, and there oxygen and whatever else is in the air goes picked up by red blood cells, and with every beat of our hearts, that blood and carrying the air with it goes to every cell in our bodies. And when you breathe out, you don't breathe all of the air out, your lungs would collapse. Half of the air stays in your lungs. And what does come out of my nose goes straight up we can't because we're not connected, but it goes straight up the nose of everybody else around. So I tell children, air is the most important thing that we need. We can't do without it for more than 3 minutes. And yet we use air as a garbage can, and we're not willing to even pay for using air to pour our carbon or whatever. Axe the tax is a big mantra now of the conservatives. They don't want to pay for the carbon we're putting in the atmosphere. Mr. Stephen Harper, when he was Prime Minister of Canada, says, we can't do anything about our emissions into the atmosphere. That's crazy economics. For 10 years, he was a Prime Minister of Canada thinking that it was crazy to pay to use the atmosphere. And by saying it's crazy economics, he was telling us the economy is more important than the atmosphere that gives us air to breathe, that gives us weather, climate, and the seasons. That's crazy. And it forgets the fact that the word economics comes from the same word as ecology. Ecos is the Greek word for household or domain. It's where we live. Ecology is the study of our relationship with the whole planet. Ecologists try to determine what is it that enables the species to survive for long periods of time. I call that sustainable development. Economics is the management of our household or domain. Now, you would think that economists would go, oh, wait, before we say we should do this, what are those ecologists telling us? Because the ecologists should tell us what the limits are to what the economy can do. But no, we don't do that. We think the economy is the source of everything that matters. And so we've got to keep that economy growing. Nothing on the planet thinks it can grow forever except economists. Nothing can. We live in a finite world. The economy, the global economy, is already way too big for the planet to sustain it. But we think this system we've developed is, and to show you the insanity of this, Mark Carney, one of the leading candidates now for political office, he wrote a book called Values. And in the first chapter, he tells us that Amazon, Jeff Bezos' company, is valued by the economy in the tens of billions of dollars. Amazon, the rainforest, the greatest ecosystem on the planet, has no economic value until it's logged, mined, dammed, or burned down to grow soybeans, cattle, or cities. Now, if that isn't a demonstration of the fundamental problem we face, and yet economics has been elevated to this position where it is the most important thing in our lives. And, you know, in the last 100 years, we've seen this remarkable shift in the way that humans live. In 1900, there was no city in Canada that had 1 million people. And most people in Canada and around the world lived in rural village communities because our lives are still built around agriculture and, you know, logging and stuff like that. But by the year 2000, most people in the world now lived in big cities. The biggest cities in the world, like Shanghai and Tokyo, have more people in the city than in all of Canada. We have 3 cities, at least in Canada now, with more than 1 million people. And in a city, you think, well, nature's okay. We've got parks out there and we've got reserves. But here, the most important thing is that Dad has a job, because the job is how we get the money to buy the things that we want. And so we don't even see how dependent we still are on nature. You know, every one of us is 60 to 70% water. We're a part of the hydrologic cycle because water is cartwheeling around the planet. We take that water in, and then it leaks out of our skin and our eyes and our pee and our poop. And we can last a lot longer without water, but 4 to 6 days without water, you're dead. We drink contaminated water, we're sick. And yet we pour crap into the water as if somehow it's not going to affect us. You know, and it's the same thing. Our food comes from the soil. All of our food was once alive. Most of it was grown in the soil, but we treat soil as a garbage can. So this is a fundamental disconnect that we haven't recognized, and this is why Indigenous people are so important to us. Indigenous, and I've been to many feasts and funerals, marriages and potlatches, and always in their ceremonies, they thank their creator or Mother Nature for all of the generosity of Mother Nature. And they always promise, we will act, what they say, act in a good way, to ensure that nature can continue to be generous. And that's the thing that's missing in the way that we're acting now. There is no sense of reciprocity, that in taking all of this abundance and benefit from nature, we have a responsibility. to act in a good way, to ensure that nature can continue to be generous. And so we've built this economic system that is all about us. It's all about human productivity and human innovation, and pays no attention to nature's productivity, that nature's generosity in allowing us to share. And now the science is overwhelmingly powerful that says that we have passed so many planetary boundaries. There are all kinds of limits beyond which we should not go if we want to be sustainable. The amount of carbon in the atmosphere, the pH of the oceans, the amount of available fresh water, the nitrogen cycle. There are 9 boundaries that Johann Rockström in Berlin has defined that are what every animal should stay within those boundaries. We are the only creature that understands the boundaries and sees what the limits are. All other creatures, they just go about doing what they do because that's what they evolved to do. We boast that we're intelligent, and now we see the limits. But in the name of the economy, we don't care about those limits.
Do you feel like we're at a point where it's too late to take action? Because I feel like there's a lot of people who lose hope.
I've been told for all my life on television, you can't say that. It's too depressing. And, all the while we were going in this terrible direction. The scientists have been screaming about it. Something's got to do. In 1992, more than half of all Nobel Prize winners said we may have as little as 10 years to avoid absolute catastrophe. And we've been doing nothing to really do it. In 1988, at a major international conference on the atmosphere in Toronto, the delegates there said, look, this is as dangerous as an all-out global nuclear war. They called for a 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in 15 years. If we had done it, we wouldn't have the problem we have today, but we didn't. And every year since 1988, our emissions have continued to climb. And that's why Greta Thunberg had such a powerful impact. She said, as a kid, I take science seriously. And what the scientists are saying is that we don't have a future. So then the question is, how do you respond to that? Do you hope, look at our record. Our track record says, no, we're not doing anything about that. So where is the hope? We've been using hope as a drug. Oh, no. Well, you have to have hope, something good. Look at reality and see what the scientists have been saying. All I can say is we have passed all kinds of limits. If you look at reality of how we've responded, so then what do you do? We don't know enough to say there is no possibility. All of the science indicates we have overshot nature's capacity to support us. But we don't know that for sure. I believe if we can pull back and give nature, you see, all of our fences around our parks, our property are wrong. The fences should be holding humans back. We are the predator. We're the mega predator. We've got to protect all of nature and return nature to where we've taken over. I can only say that we've got to try. And what defines us as a species is not whether we win, but that we try. And if you have children, if you're a child, if you're a grandparent, you have no choice but to try. But understand now that these global forces that are affecting us, we've overshot the safe limits. And what we have to try to do now is focus on our local communities. Those are going to be the units of survival. And I think, the Trumps, they've triumphed. They're going to trash the planet. But let's at least hope that our communities can be as self-sufficient and independent of these global forces of the economy as possible. So I say turn your eyes into your local community. If we can't have our local communities being strong and self-sufficient, as self-sufficient as possible, how do we expect the whole planet to be? It's the sum total of all that we do in these local communities. But in a way, I've given up hope that these big global forces, the one organization we have, the United Nations, has been incapable of dealing with those. So if the UN can't do it, we've got to turn to our local communities.
It sounds like that would be a good starting point for this question of just, I personally have never heard so many people talk about burnout and the climate crisis just being one of those elements. So what is your advice for balancing, knowing that the climate crisis needs as many voices as it can get? What's your advice for balancing that, the struggle of, God, I don't have energy for the news, and also we need more people in this fight?
Well, all I can say is Mr. Zelensky's been fighting a pretty hopeless situation in Ukraine, and he's been fighting it and fighting it, and you see how he's been treated by Mr. Trump. It's absolutely horrifying because, in a way, Zelensky's battle is a metaphor for the battle that we're fighting for the planet. And the reality is, he's losing that battle. And now he's being cut off by, one of the strongest supporters, the United States. You have no choice. I mean, what do you say? Okay, I'm giving up. So on the climate trend there, I feel that Mother Nature, is going to do it for us. We've had 28 COP meetings, 28 COP meetings. And we think the next one is going to make the difference. Like, forget I haven't gone back to a COP meeting on climate now for years because what's the point? Mother Nature is going to tell us. She's been telling us now for a long time, but we're not paying attention. And so her messages are going to keep getting stronger and stronger. But it seems to me we're so caught up in our triumph of winning over nature, that Mother Nature is going to have to bat last and do that. Meanwhile, I think we have to batten down the hatches and work on our local communities.
As a broadcaster, speaking to us also as broadcasters, what do you think the media can do to really push climate solutions forward?
Well, the media, I believe, have been part of our ignorance. I can't remember the year, but the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, is an intergovernmental panel so that every country has its input on their reports. Every one of their reports has come out way lower than their predictions of where we're going to happen. Sea level rise, glaciers melting, amount of carbon in the atmosphere. Their reports have always been watered down because Saudi Arabia, Russia, the United States, they all have input in that final report. The IPCC came out with a special report a few years ago, and they said 1.5 degrees must be the temperature. We keep the temperature from rising above 1.5. Above 1.5, all hell, chaos happens. The day after that report came out, marijuana became legal in Canada. Guess what disappeared from the media then? The IPCC report. A couple of years later, the United Nations reported on biodiversity. And I read that over half of the species that were on the planet when I was born in 1936 are now extinct. In my lifetime, more than half of the biodiversity on the planet has gone extinct. The next day, Harry and Meghan had a baby. And guess what disappeared from the media? So the media, and when you look at social media now, a scientist has no more credibility than some jerk who says, oh, I woke up with a wart on my head and that must mean blah, blah, blah. I mean, what the hell? What's going on in the social media? So what avenues do we have now? Where do you go? To me, what we have are the CBC, which is paid for by the Canadian taxpayer. We have the Guardian. We have the New York Times, maybe, but the media are a part of the problem, I believe.
Well, we're grateful for you to be sharing your time with this. In your experience now, how are you approaching your activism compared to when you first got into it? Like, do you have a message for yourself when you first started getting into environmentalism?
I started in 1962, and I was compelled by a woman. And women are, to me, patriarchy is as much of our environmental problem as anything. But a woman, it was Rachel Carson, published a book called Silent Spring, all about the unexpected effects of pesticides. And that book galvanized the environmental movement. And in the time since her book was published 10 years later, the United Nations formed UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program, began all of these the COP process. We've seen all of these events where in 1962, when her book came out, there was not a single department of the environment in any government on the planet. She put the word environment onto the table. So you see this huge growth. But after all of these years, guess what? We use more chemical pesticides than we ever have. So to me, the message has always been that we are made possible because of the air, the water, the soil, and we should be paying attention to that. So I can say that I am a part of a movement that has fundamentally failed. And we better face up to that now. The triumph of Donald Trump is a triumph of the most destructive force we face on the planet, which is capitalism. Capitalism tries to put a value on everything, and everything is seen then through economic eyes. And how much is it worth in dollars and cents? So that's what we have to understand. And everything that we do, we're caught up in that, Please, when you turn on the tap, do you have any idea where that water comes from? Mother Nature cleansed it. I love to talk to kids in Toronto. I say, when you turn on the tap, where does it come from? They don't know. It comes from Lake Ontario. When you flush the toilet, where does that water in there go? Well, it ends up, after being treated, it ends up in Lake Ontario, where you get the water you're drinking. We are part of this cycle of nature. And we have become this very destructive, everything we do. When you buy a new set of clothing, where did that come from? And where does it go when you throw it away? When you turn on the lights, where does your electricity come from? We've got to be much more aware, people. That's my message. Be aware.
Gosh, thank you so much for your time. What an honor it has been to speak with you. And we're just so grateful that you were able to join us for this interview.
Yeah, thank you for all that you do.
Thank you.
That was our conversation with Dr. David Suzuki. I'm still fangirling, even just saying that.
Right before the conversation started, we were sitting beside each other going, should we run a lap right now? Just because we were so excited.
Buzzing.
Yeah, buzzing. Absolutely. What were some of your big takeaways from that conversation?
I think the biggest question that I really have, even just going into this podcast, is how can we help the planet? Because sometimes I feel like it's just too late and everything's going to fall apart. And even though he kind of reassured that fear of mine, he really brought up a lot of good points as well of how we can build community and how we can still do things if we all stick together. So I think it was a little reassuring in not the best ways, but also reassuring in a lot of good ways, if that makes sense.
Totally.
Yeah. What did you take away?
Well, when he got into talking about media and was giving all those examples of stories that overtook some really important headlines.
Yeah.
That actually reminded me, and this was an article done by a piece of journalism done by Maclean's. I can put it in the show notes, but it was the day that Canada declared a climate emergency. Was a day later was the Raptors parade.
Oh.
And Drake's private jet was flying around with no one in it.
Oh my goodness.
And the amount of emissions that would be putting into the atmosphere a day after our country declared a climate emergency. And of course, that was the major headline, especially here. We are recording in Toronto, so especially here. And it's just one of those, what do you do? What do you do? And it just, that really, I think for me being in media, for you being in media, was a wake-up call to go, okay, but what can we be doing?
Totally.
How do we move forward knowing that, you know?
And use the power that we have too to talk about certain things, to even though that is an exciting thing to talk about when they won, to also focus on what's going on in the world, even though it might not be as exciting or as good news to hear. So yeah, I think that is so important. And I can't believe that was the exact same time. I had no idea.
Yeah.
Just goes to show.
Balance.
Exactly.
Yeah, so what are you going to do differently now that we've had that conversation?
I am going to find more ways to help just in my own community, because I think if we all focus on that, that is where the real big change is going to come into effect. So whether it's even like, I've talked about how I love going on walks with my fiance, and we talked recently about how we should just like bring gloves with us or like a poker and like pick up garbage while we're going on a walk. Just little things like that, I think will help our planet and hopefully encourage other people too as well.
You know what's really neat about that too? If you get into bigger cities, a lot of them have pockets that are communities too. So how overwhelming is it to wrap your head around the volume of people that are in Toronto? But Toronto is filled with little pockets, communities,
Right.
pocket of communities, which just seems pretty hopeful, you know, in terms of how much messaging was surrounded about community in that conversation. I think, yeah, totally what you're saying. I'll echo that, but also just really thinking about the media aspect and
Right.
how we can be moving forward in our career, because that is so much of our life and that is so much of how our time is spent. So there seems like so much opportunity there.
Yeah. And even just learning more, just being more educated, you start to notice things. I feel like I'm already looking at the world differently, and we're just getting started on this podcast. So I hope that's a big takeaway for anyone that's listening as well. Thanks so much for listening. I'm Shannon.
And I'm Sarah, and thank you so much for coming out to the Earth Day party.
Earth Day Party podcast is in support of WWF Canada. Help protect wildlife and fight climate change during Earth Month with a gift to WWF Canada. You can give now at wwf.ca/earthmonth.